ton of information out there. It seemed like just an abduction. Until I stumbled upon a podcast called Southern Gone, and the host interviewed Carrie's sister. And after hearing that interview, I definitely think there is a conspiracy surrounding Carrie's disappearance. I will say it again, there isn't a ton of information about this case that I could find through digging through old newspaper archives, and most of the information does come from an interview that Margaret gave Southern Gone. Okay, let's get into it. Carolyn Elizabeth Smith, or Carrie as she went by, was from Cleveland, Tennessee. She had one sister named Margaret. Carrie's family was very well off. She grew up pretty wealthy. Carrie's sister would later say that Carrie was a very naturally kind person. She was a great friend. She was someone who always did the right thing, but still someone who was a ton of fun to be around. Carrie attended Auburn College, where she majored in communications, and her sister Margaret, who was 1 year younger than her, also attended Auburn. So they did the whole college experience together. They even were in the same sorority, and they were just super close to each other. Carrie graduated college and decided that she wanted to go to law school. And when she announced that she wanted to go to law school, those around Carrie were pretty shocked. Carrie was definitely very smart, but she had picked her major in college, her communications major, because it had the least amount of math classes, less than any other major. So anyway, she decides to go to law school, and so she applies, gets in, and she worked very hard. It was during her time at school where she met her husband, Earl Lawson, and the two were married after her second year of law school, and they moved to Jasper, Alabama. They bought this cute small little home, and Carrie was commuting from Jasper to her law school the entire third year of school. Margaret, Carrie's sister, would also become a lawyer. So these girls, they come from money. They both attended a good college and then furthered their careers by going to law school. And they had their entire futures ahead of them. Until one night, when something would happen that changed the trajectory of their entire lives. So our case really begins in Jasper, Alabama in 1991, when Carrie was 25 years old. She had just very recently graduated from the University of Alabama Law School, and she had gotten a job with a law firm. She had just started working there as our story begins. She was still waiting to see if she had passed the bar. So this is a very exciting time in Carrie's life. She's done with college. She's taken the bar. Not quite sure yet if she had passed it, she would never live to find the news out that she had passed the bar. Like I said, she was living with her husband, Earl Lawson, who is also a lawyer. Now, there will be some speculation into the law firm that Earl worked for, because according to Carrie's sister Margaret, he would sometimes come home from work with big bundles of cash and tell Carrie they couldn't deposit the money, so they had to keep the cash in their house rather than putting it in the bank. Walker County, Alabama, where this takes place, is a weird place. It's seemingly quiet. No real violent crimes were happening at the time. But there was a distrust of the law enforcement. Like, people didn't trust the cops in this area. Carrie's sister told the Southern Con podcast, quote, "It is a very strange place. There is a lot of money going through Walker County. That being said, I've never met nicer people than the people of Walker County. But our family was shocked by the corruption going on there." End quote. So in 1991, Carrie and Earl had been married for 2 years, and they were at home on the night of September 11th, 1991. They're asleep when they get a phone call around 3 a.m. from a local hospital. The woman on the other end said that she was a nurse at the hospital, and that Earl's father, Earl Sr., had been admitted to the hospital and was in, like, grave condition, and they needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible. Carrie and Earl rushed out of their home and headed towards their car. And in their garage, a masked man appeared holding a rifle. And when Carrie and Earl see this man, he's pointing the rifle at them, and he tells Carrie to tie her husband up. So she does as she is told. She used duct tape to tie Earl up while he is laying face down on the ground. And once Earl was tied up, Carrie was forced into her own car, a 1991 Ford Explorer, and she was abducted by the gunman. Carrie Lawson would never be seen again, although she would talk to Earl on the phone one more time before vanishing forever. When Earl was able to, wiggle free out of the duct tape, he was locked out of his home. They had locked the door on their way outside, and the man who had abducted Carrie in her car had the keys to the house. They were on the same keyring. So Earl had to kick down the door to get back inside to call 911. Except the first call Earl made wasn't to 911. It was to his father. After speaking on the phone with his dad, Earl called the police. Now, the FBI became involved in this case very early on. So the next morning, a call comes in from a man demanding ransom from Earl for Carrie's safe return. He demanded to speak to Carrie. He said he wouldn't pay safely if he paid a $300,000 ransom. Now, this call was recorded, or it was supposed to be recorded by the FBI, but there was like a technical issue and the call was not recorded. And this would be the last time that anyone would ever hear Carrie's voice again. Now, Carrie's family had a lot of money, so they were able to gather the ransom money quickly and get it ready. Earl Sr., Carrie's father-in-law, was, for whatever reason, the person who would be making the drop. However, the original location where the money was supposed to be left was this place in Coleman, and when Earl Sr. got there just happened to be several police cars in the parking lot. Like, it was totally a coincidence, but it spooked everyone, including the kidnapper. So another drop-off was arranged. There were several calls from the kidnapper to Earl's home. The second ransom drop-off would end up being totally botched as well. The family then just stopped hearing from the suspect. All communication went silent. And finally there was a call with instructions saying that the money needed to be dropped off into a culvert at a specific location. So the FBI put a tracker in the bag of money, hoping that it would lead them to wherever Carrie was being held, and they could recover her safely. This time, Earl Jr., Carrie's husband, would be making the drop. He would be dropping off $300,000 in cash. And this drop took place on September 13th. Now, like I said, the FBI was involved, and they were allowing for the drop of the money, but they were also preparing the family for what to expect. They said they would have a better chance of recovering an abducted person if the person was found on the same day they were taken, and that each day that passed, the likelihood of getting that person alive, or back alive, gets smaller and smaller. Even though the money drop was about to happen, they were just being realistic with the family, with expectations of bringing Carrie home safely. The money was dropped by Earl with a tracker in the bag, and it was picked up, but Carrie was never released. And this would end up being another major failure in Carrie's case. Margaret would later say about the drop, quote, "It was very strange. They had a tracker in the bag and a tracker on Earl, and for some reason one of them got switched off or something, and then they were on the same frequency. I'm not sure exactly what the problem was, but the tracker in the bag got switched off somehow, and so the FBI was watching where it was dropped, and they were waiting for someone to come, and nobody came, and then they went to check on the bag, and it was gone," end quote. So the FBI was watching this tracker, and it wasn't moving, so they went to look, only to find that the money had been picked up. It was gone. And so were the chances of finding Carrie. Carrie Jerry's car was found 1 week later in the woods in Winston County, Alabama. There had been a lot of mistakes up to this point. The trackers had failed or gotten disconnected or something. Some of the calls the suspect had made to the Lawson home that were supposed to be recorded were not being recorded. Just everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. And so the FBI did have like one recorded call of their suspect talking. And so they decided to release it to the media, hoping that someone would recognize the suspect's voice and call in so they could have like a tip to know where to lead the investigation. The pressure was really on them at this point to solve the case and try and find Carrie. The FBI quickly identified one of the kidnappers as Jerry Bland, this farmer who had fallen on hard times. Jerry was having health problems and he had just gotten out of the hospital after having open heart surgery. I'm not sure exactly how the FBI found Jerry, if they found him before they got the call, but a caller called in and said that he recognized the voice, that it was a local man, a landscaper, and he was the man on this tape. This landscaper man was not the guy on the tape. He wasn't involved at all. But by the time that was proven, his entire life had been torn apart, like by the time he was cleared. But then another call came in, and this one was about Jerry Bland. Jerry's brother had made the call to police, saying that he believed that Jerry was the caller. Investigators brought Jerry in for questioning, and they got a warrant to search his home. Inside, they found several guns and some marijuana, but they didn't find any like large amounts of cash or anything like that. I don't know the reasoning for this because the FBI did suspect him of being involved, and they had just searched his home and found marijuana, which they could have arrested him on, but they did not arrest Jerry after the search of his home. They took him in and questioned him, and then they let him go home. Also interesting, at the time of the search, investigators didn't take guns from Jerry's home. They left them in his home. And this is really weird to me because there had been a gun used in the commission of a crime. The gunman had held Carrie and Earl up with a gun. But these guns were not taken in as evidence. It's likely that the feds probably felt like they needed more evidence before they brought charges against him. And they didn't find anything in his home directly tying him to Carrie Lawson. Like, she wasn't there. There was no evidence placing her inside the home. So they let him go free. They kind of began looking into his known associates. Jerry went home and told his wife and daughters to leave the home. Now, like I said, police totally suspected that he was involved, so they weren't just going to let him, like, disappear. They had surveillance on Jerry's house, so they watched as his wife and girls left. Then the decision was made that they were going to go back in and arrest Jerry on drug Anyway, now remember, Jerry had recently gotten out of the hospital for open heart surgery. This is important because he was very, very weak. You don't just jump or like bounce back from something like that. Anyway, the next morning, they entered the home to find that Jerry was dead from what was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Later, the angle of the wound would be like highly speculated about because given Jerry's recent surgery, the angle at which he was shot seemed very unlikely that he had actually shot himself. People close to the case are also quick to point out that Jerry should have been arrested the day that his home was searched the day before, when the marijuana was found inside his home. They point out that he was in police custody while he was being interviewed, while his home was being searched. But he was allowed to go back into his home where law enforcement knew he had guns. But for whatever reason, they chose not to remove the guns from the home. There was this very short window of time when he was allowed back into his home, and he chose to end his own life. When police heard gunshots, they didn't enter the home right away. Many people believe that Jerry hadn't pulled the trigger, that someone had entered his home and killed him to keep something covered up. Something that maybe even local police were in on keeping covered up. So like I said, up to this point, everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. And this list was getting bigger and bigger. And the phone calls were not properly recorded, and the money, the tracker somehow hadn't been turned on. The guns weren't taken from Jerry's home, and he was allowed to go back to his home. Gunshots were heard, but police didn't enter the home. In fact, while they were watching the front of the home, no one was watching the back of the home. So it is possible that someone had entered Jerry's home from the back door, killed him, and snuck out. No one can really ever say for sure if Jerry had been the one who had chosen to end his own life, because it seems very possible someone could have easily slipped in and out of the back of the home without police detection. So when police finally do enter the home and they find Jerry's body, they also find a note. This is like a suicide note, and it says that the money found inside of his home was from a drug deal. He had tried to do a drug deal. He made a lot of money, and the money in his home was from that, and that he had never touched Carrie Lawson and was in no way involved in her abduction. Then in this note, it says that all the money could be found in the ceiling tiles. Now remember, the feds had searched the home the day before with a search warrant, and they had not found any money. But then the next day, they look in the attic, and they found all of the ransom money. And again, this was alarming to people, because how had they missed this during their search the day before? According to some sources, the money hadn't been in the attic the day before when the home had been searched. The FBI believes that Jerry had ended his life Anyways, things just continued to get stranger and stranger. There was this apartment complex nearby, and this kid was outside playing one day and found a cassette tape, and he gave it to his dad. And the tape, which had been found just like by the pool, was a tape of the now deceased Jerry Bland speaking to a woman, and it would come out that Sheila Bland, Jerry's wife, knew he was up to something, but she thought he was having an affair, and so she began taping all of his phone conversations. And she ended up with all of these tapes of her husband talking to a woman, and supposedly they were talking about the kidnapping. She didn't know what to do with the tapes, so she gave them to her friend, and the friend said she would get rid of them for her. But then one ended up at this apartment complex out by the pool. At this point, one suspect is dead, and Carrie is still missing. Investigators began looking into known associates of Jerry's, and one woman stood out to them. Her name was Karen McPherson, and she was a mom. She was a truck driver, and she was identified as one of the accomplices to Carrie's abduction. So Karen McPherson was also actually a cousin to the now deceased suspect. They were very close. Anyway, so the FBI feel like she is somehow involved in all of this. The feds served a search warrant for Karen's home, and they found thousands of dollars in cash, which was suspicious because she was a truck driver living like a very blue-collar type of life. So finding a huge amount of cash set off some red flags. The FBI would later say that she had been the woman who had made the call to the Lawsons on the night Carrie was abducted. The woman calling pretending to be a nurse. Once Jerry was found, everyone needs to, wrap up this case ASAP, because Jerry is dead, and they're not gonna let anyone else get away. So Karen was quickly arrested for kidnapping. They are not going to let another suspect out of their custody because the hope is that Carrie's still alive somewhere, and they're desperately trying to find her. So Karen admitted to her part in the kidnapping, saying that she had been the one to make the phone call to the Lawson family, pretending to be a nurse, and that she had been in charge of taking care of Carrie while they were waiting for the ransom money. According to her, Carrie was alive and well while she was staying at Carrie's house, or being held captive at Karen's house. She claims she had no idea where Carrie was taken after Jerry came and picked her up from her home. Carrie's family put up a reward for information, but no one came forward with any information about her case. Karen pled guilty to kidnapping in November of 1991, and she was given a deal that if she agreed to sit down with Carrie's father and tell him everything, that the family would not oppose parole after she served 10 years for kidnapping. So she makes this deal, and she sits down with Carrie Lawson's dad in jail, and then clams up. She doesn't come clean. She refuses to do her part and answer questions, and the deal sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No one knows why Karen changed her mind, and to this day, no one knows why Carrie was targeted, and who else, if anyone, was involved. Carrie was declared dead, like legally dead, after 2 years, and her remains have never been found. Karen straight up has refused to speak about what happened, and the Lawson family was left with more questions than answers. Okay, so let's talk about how weird this case is. I've never heard of anyone getting life in prison without the possibility of parole for their involvement in kidnapping. I'm not saying it's never happened, I've just never heard of it. And at this point, when you're already in prison for the rest of your life, why not talk to police or the family and tell them what happened? You're literally in prison for the rest of your life. You have nothing to lose. Now, kidnapping can come with a life sentence and even the death penalty if you kill someone while kidnapping them. But it seems to me like Karen is scared to death to talk about the abduction at all, and there's way more involved than we know. She had been given $10,000 for her part to take care of Carrie while they were waiting for the ransom. Jerry Bland, who supposedly was the person who held Earl and Carrie at gunpoint and abducted her, was incredibly frail and weak from his open heart surgery like the previous week or 2 weeks. It seems suspicious that he was able to carry out his actual part in the abduction alone. Plus, he didn't know the couple. They had no known association with him, so why had he chosen them? Why kidnap Carrie and not Earl? And how did he know that Earl's father wasn't already dead when he came up with the whole story about Earl's father being in the hospital and being very sick? How did he know their car had enough gas to get away from the scene? There are a lot of unknowns in this case, and it seems like someone else had to have been involved, someone who knew the couple personally. Now, Gary's family has a lot of money, and they were able to gather the ransom quickly, but my guess would be not very many people would be able to gather that amount of money as quickly as they had. So who knew the couple and even Gary's family situation well enough to orchestrate this entire thing? And what is Karen so scared of that she still to this day refuses to talk, refuses to tell the family what happened? In my opinion, something happened from the time she signed her plea to the time she sat down with Gary's dad in jail to tell him everything, and whatever happened completely changed her mind. Also, everything was going wrong with the investigation, and that seems to kind of point to local law enforcement purposefully intervening and foiling the investigation. A lot of people believe that Earl Jr., Carrie's husband, was involved. When Carrie's sister was asked point blank, "Do you believe Earl was involved in the abduction and disappearance of your sister?" her reply was, quote, "Yeah, I'm not gonna answer that. I'm sorry. Well, it would not shock me if his law firm was involved in something," end quote. Now, there was a life insurance policy on Carrie at the time that she was taken, Margaret is now the only living person in our family. Both of her parents have since died, and Carrie has never been found. I just quickly want to cite my sources for this video. I got information from the Birmingham Real-Time News article titled Carrie Lawson, Kidnapper Karen McPherson Again Denied Parole in Lawyer's 1991 Disappearance, an episode of Southern Gone, episode 23 titled Carrie Lawson Part 2. TheGrunge.com had an article titled Inside the Mysterious Abduction of Carrie Lawson, and that was published on August 5th, 2020 by Tom Misjord. Okay guys, I really want to know what your thoughts are on this case. Do you think Jerry did it? Do you think there was some kind of cover-up? Do you think the husband was involved? I really want to know everyone's thoughts, so leave them in the comments. Please join us over on Patreon for our cruel summer event that I'm doing. I'm super excited about it. I usually do a fall 12 Days of Terror leading up to Halloween, but I thought cruel summer would be the perfect thing to get us through the summer, and I'm excited. So please join us over there. It's only $5 a month, and you get access to all of the last 2 years worth of Patreon content as well. See you guys soon.